The Riverstone Country Club had never looked so warm and inviting. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, their light catching the gold threads in the linen tablecloths. Every table was dressed with white roses and tiny flickering candles, and along the far wall, a series of framed photographs charted the long career of Helen Markham. 42 years as a nurse, 42 years of midnight shifts, calm hands and quiet heroics in the ward. Helen, 69 and radiant, sat at the head table in a deep teal dress, her silver hair swept back into a low twist. She was surrounded by colleagues, friends, and family, the people who had gathered to celebrate her retirement. Her laugh rose above the gentle hum of conversation, warm and full, like someone who had finally reached a well-earned pause in life's race. Across from her, Laura Bennett watched her mother with a quiet kind of pride. At 45, she carried the same strong cheekbones as Helen, but her hair, dark and straight, was pulled into a neat low bun. She sipped her champagne slowly, savoring the sight of her mother enjoying the night she deserved for so long. Beside Laura sat Graham Bennett, her husband of 15 years. Graham was 53, tall and well-kept, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and the sort of easy charm that had once made him the center of any room. Tonight, though, he seemed distracted. His gaze flicked toward the ballroom entrance every few minutes, as if expecting someone. Laura noticed but said nothing at first. She wanted this night to be about her mother, not about the subtle shift in Graham's posture or the way his jaw tightened when the MC announced that another wave of guests had arrived. Then the shift happened. Through the double doors walked Claudia Hayes. At 66, Claudia was elegance personified, tall, slender, with an immaculate sweep of blonde hair and a string of pearls resting perfectly on her collarbone. Her sapphire dress shimmered as she moved, drawing eyes without trying. She carried herself like someone who had always been admired, and perhaps even counted on it. Claudia had been part of Helen's life for decades, a close friend since their 20s, the kind who had been present for every major moment: births, funerals, anniversaries, and holidays. To Laura, she was almost like an aunt, though less maternal and more theatrical. Laura's eyes followed Claudia as she crossed the room, greeting Helen with an embrace that lingered just a second too long. When she straightened, Claudia's gaze swept the head table and landed on Graham. There it was, that flicker. It was the kind of look Laura might have missed if she hadn't been watching closely. A subtle, almost imperceptible curve of the lips, the faintest spark of recognition that wasn't meant for her. Graham's expression didn't change, but his eyes held Claudia's for a beat too long. Laura's champagne suddenly tasted flat. She looked back at her mother, who was beaming as Claudia took a seat at the next table. Helen reached for Claudia's hand, giving it a squeeze, utterly unaware of anything but the joy of having her oldest friend here to celebrate. The jazz trio in the corner struck up a gentle tune. Waiters began circulating with plates of seared salmon and roasted vegetables. The evening was unfolding as perfectly as planned, at least for everyone else in the room. For Laura, the air felt heavier. She tried to push away the thought that had begun to coil in her stomach, telling herself she was being paranoid. Claudia was her mother's dearest friend. Graham was her husband. There was no reason to imagine that look meant anything at all. And yet, she couldn't shake it. As the MC's voice floated over the microphone, introducing the first round of speeches, Laura glanced once more between Graham and Claudia. She told herself she'd imagined it, that the flicker of familiarity was nothing more than the comfort of old family friends seeing each other after weeks apart. But in the pit of her stomach, something else whispered, "No, that wasn't nothing." Laura smiled when Helen caught her eye, forcing herself to stay composed. She had learned long ago that sometimes the smartest thing you could do in a room full of people was simply watch, quietly, carefully, until the truth presented itself. And tonight, Laura decided she would be watching very closely. 2 months earlier, the thought of Graham and Claudia sharing anything beyond polite conversation would have seemed absurd to Laura. Claudia had been in her life since she was a child. She was the woman who brought her a charm bracelet for her 10th birthday, the one who sent postcards from Paris when Laura was in college, the friend Helen leaned on when Laura's father passed away. But the first sign came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Laura had been rushing out the door for work, balancing her tote bag, a coffee thermos, and a stack of files, when she spotted something draped across the passenger seat of her SUV. At first she thought it was one of her scarves, maybe left behind after the weekend. But when she picked it up, the silk slid through her fingers in a way she didn't recognize. Smooth, expensive, smelling faintly of gardenia and something powdery underneath. It wasn't hers. She turned it over, noting the small designer label stitched in gold thread. Not the kind of brand she would ever splurge on, but exactly the kind Claudia might. A strange unease settled in her chest, though she quickly pushed it away. Maybe Graham had given a neighbor a ride. Maybe Helen had left it there after lunch last week. There were a dozen innocent explanations. That Sunday, the scarf found its owner. Helen had invited Laura and Graham for brunch at her house. Scrambled eggs, warm rolls, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Claudia was there, perched elegantly at the table, laughing at one of Helen's stories. The scarf, looped loosely around her neck, caught the light as she leaned forward to butter her toast. Laura felt her pulse hitch. She didn't say anything. She didn't even let her gaze linger. But the unease from earlier in the week bloomed into something sharper. It would have been easier to dismiss if Graham's behavior hadn't already begun to shift. He'd started keeping his phone close, face down on the counter, slid into his pocket the moment it buzzed. If Laura asked who it was, he'd shrug and say, "Work," or "wrong number," his tone breezy but clipped. There were the nights, too, more frequent than before, when he claimed to have client dinners or late meetings. She'd hear his key in the door well past 9, smell the faint trace of aftershave and something sweeter clinging to him. The worst part was how her mother unknowingly stitched the threads together without realizing she was doing it. Helen would mention in passing that Claudia had been in town more often lately, or that Graham had kindly helped Claudia carry in groceries since her hip had been bothering her. "He's such a gentleman," Helen said one afternoon over tea, smiling fondly. "I don't know what I'd do without friends like him and Claudia." Laura had smiled back, but the words lodged in her chest like a stone. She began to notice other, smaller things. Graham spending longer in the driveway after pulling in, as if finishing a conversation before coming inside. A new playlist on his phone, all jazz standards, Claudia's favorite. The way his expression would smooth into something neutral whenever Claudia's name came up in conversation. It wasn't enough to accuse him. It wasn't even enough to justify the sudden spike of adrenaline she felt whenever she caught him looking at his phone. But it was enough to keep her awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the one who seemed to be quietly slipping away from her. One Thursday evening, while sorting laundry, Laura found herself folding one of Graham's shirts and catching a faint scent clinging to the collar. Not her perfume, not Helen's laundry detergent, but that same gardenia powder blend she'd smelled on the scarf. This time she didn't push it away. She tucked the shirt into the basket, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor until the feeling crystallized into something clear. If there was an answer, she needed to find it before the question ate her alive. At the time, she didn't know how deep the answer would go, or that it wouldn't just threaten her marriage. It would ripple through her family, right to the heart of the woman being celebrated that night in the Riverstone ballroom. But she did know this. Whatever Graham and Claudia thought they were doing, it wouldn't stay in the dark forever. And when it came to light, it would be on her terms. It happened at one of those small neighborly gatherings Helen loved to host. A few of her old nursing colleagues had dropped by for coffee and cake on a Saturday afternoon, and Laura had come to help clear dishes and keep the conversation flowing. The weather was crisp and bright, and Helen had thrown open the sliding doors to the back garden, letting the smell of rosemary and freshly cut grass drift into the house. Guests wandered in and out, sipping tea, chatting in clusters. At some point, Laura ducked into the living room to answer her phone. It was just a quick call from her assistant about a Monday meeting, but when she stepped back toward the patio, she heard voices, low and close, just beyond the hedge that separated Helen's lawn from the neighbors. The words froze her mid-step. "She has no idea," Claudia's voice murmured, smooth and unhurried. "Just a few more weeks." Laura's pulse thudded in her ears. Graham's reply was quiet, almost conspiratorial. "After the banquet, it will all be easier." There was a brief pause, the rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of shoes on stone, and then Helen called from the kitchen, asking Laura to bring in the coffee tray. Laura's hands moved on autopilot, pouring cups, passing plates, smiling when spoken to. But inside, her mind was spinning. She replayed those few seconds over and over, searching for any possible benign explanation. The problem was she couldn't find one. They weren't talking about work. They weren't talking about Helen. The way Claudia's voice dipped, the way Graham's tone softened. It was the sound of two people planning something they didn't want her to know about. By the time she got home that evening, Laura's unease had hardened into a decision. If she confronted Graham now, he would have excuses ready. If she told Helen, the fallout would be immediate. And if she was wrong, she'd never forgive herself for shattering her mother's trust. No, she needed something solid, proof that couldn't be talked away. That night after Graham had gone upstairs, Laura sat in her home office scrolling through her phone until she found the number she'd saved months ago from a local community forum. It was for Victor Kane, a retired detective who now did private investigative work. He had a reputation for being discreet, the kind of man who didn't flinch at unpleasant truths. She hesitated for a moment before pressing call. His voice on the other end was calm, low, with the faint rasp of someone who'd seen too much. Kane Investigations. Mr. Kane, Laura began, keeping her voice steady. I need to hire you for something personal. They met the next afternoon in a quiet corner of a coffee shop across town. Victor looked exactly like the kind of man you'd trust with secrets. In his early 60s, with close-cropped steel gray hair, sharp brown eyes, and a notebook already open in front of him. Laura slid a small folder across the table. Inside were a few notes she'd scribbled down the night before, dates and times Graham had claimed to be working late, Claudia's recent visits to town, the brunch at Helen's house. She'd also printed a photo of the scarf. I don't know what's going on, she said, but I think my husband and my mother's friend are involved. I can't accuse them without proof, and I can't have anyone else find out, especially my mother. Not until I know for certain. Victor flipped through the papers without comment, then set them down and met her eyes. How far do you want me to go? Phone records? Surveillance? Following them? I want whatever will tell me the truth, Laura said, and I want it in a way I can show anyone, without question. Victor's pen scratched against the paper as he jotted notes. 2 weeks, he said finally. Maybe less if they're careless. I'll check the inn in Riverview, the boutique hotels. If they're meeting somewhere, I'll find it. Laura nodded, sliding an envelope with his retainer fee across the table. When she stepped back out into the cool air, there was a tightness in her chest. But it wasn't entirely dread. It was something else too, the first faint edge of control. If Graham and Claudia thought they were moving towards something easier after the banquet, they had no idea what was waiting for them instead. Victor didn't take long. By the 5th day, Laura's phone buzzed with a message. Need to meet. Bring something to carry files. They chose the same coffee shop as before, a quiet mid-morning lull when most tables sat empty. Victor was already there, a manila envelope resting in front of him. He didn't bother with small talk, just pushed the envelope across the table and waited. Laura slid it open. The first sheet was a printed still image. Graham and Claudia, mid-afternoon, stepping out of a black sedan parked in front of the Riverview Inn. Graham's hand rested at the small of her back, guiding her toward the entrance. The next was a zoomed shot, their faces clear, the tilt of Claudia's head unmistakably intimate. Laura's fingers tightened on the edges of the photo, but she kept turning pages. There was a hotel receipt, a king suite for 3 hours, paid in cash. Time-stamped for one of the nights Graham had told her he was working late with a client. Another photo followed, the two of them on Claudia's balcony at dusk, wine glasses in hand. Graham leaned close, his smile easy, the kind of expression Laura hadn't seen him wear in months. Then came the jewelry store receipt, a diamond pendant purchased with Graham's personal credit card. Laura knew every gift he'd given her over the years, and this wasn't one of them. At the bottom, the signature, C. Hayes. Victor let her absorb it all before he spoke. They're not careful, he said simply. Meet regularly. The Riverview Inn. Her place. Sometimes lunch at the Old Wharf Cafe. Always the same pattern. He arrives first. She joins him within 10 minutes. Laura kept her eyes on the photos, the quiet rustle of paper loud in the otherwise still cafe. She thought of Claudia at her wedding, straightening her veil, of the handwritten cards she'd sent when Laura's son was born, of every holiday dinner where she'd sat across the table, laughing easily, as if nothing in the world could tarnish her place in this family. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Victor asked. "Or is this enough?" Laura's answer came without hesitation. "It's enough to end this, but I need one more thing, something I can use at the right moment, the kind of proof no one can walk away from." Victor reached into the envelope again, pulling out a small USB drive. "There's video," he said, "from Tuesday. They went to the Riverview again. I got them on camera walking into the room and leaving." Laura slipped the drive into her purse without looking at it. She didn't need to watch it to know what it would show. When she got home, Graham was in his study tapping at his laptop. He glanced up, smiling faintly. "Everything okay?" Laura returned the smile. Small, calm, practiced. "Fine. Just catching up with a friend." Upstairs, she set the envelope on her desk and stared at it for a long moment. The images inside felt heavy, like they carried not just proof, but weight. The weight of years, trust, and the slow erosion of both. And then slowly, a plan began to form. She thought of the Riverstone ballroom, the chandeliers, the guests. Helen's retirement banquet would be the perfect stage. Everyone important would be there. Family, colleagues, friends, Graham and Claudia included. If they wanted to conduct their affair under the radar of polite society, she would pull them into the spotlight. Laura opened her laptop and began sketching out a slideshow for Helen's banquet. The first part would be all warmth, photos from Helen's career, trips, birthdays, and weddings, a lifetime of service and love. And tucked within that, 3 slides that would change the night. 1. Graham and Claudia kissing outside the Riverview Inn. 2. The pendant receipt with Claudia's signature. 3. The short video clip of them entering the hotel room together. Her cursor hovered over the save button. She gave the file a safe, pleasant name, Banquet Memories. She'd hide it in plain sight, ready for the moment when the lights dimmed and every eye turned to the screen. In her mind, she could already hear the collective intake of breath. Laura didn't rush. She knew from watching people, in courtrooms, in offices, in her own family, that the most devastating blows landed not when you swung wildly, but when you waited until the other person had no room to dodge. The next morning, she called her mother. "Mom, I was thinking, I'd like to do something special at the banquet, a slideshow. You know, photos from your career, family memories, a real tribute." Helen's voice lit up through the phone. "Oh, Laura, that would be wonderful. You've always had such an eye for that sort of thing." Laura smiled faintly. She could practically feel Graham's shoulders relax when she mentioned it over dinner. "A slideshow? That's nice. Let me know if you need help with the tech," he offered casually, already assuming his part would be nothing more than clapping politely at the end. She needed that complacency. That weekend, Laura spent hours combing through old albums at Helen's house. Helen sat beside her, pointing out former colleagues, laughing at outdated hairstyles, pausing with misty eyes at photos of long-gone patients who had touched her life. Laura scanned everything. Candid shots from the ward, family barbecues, Helen receiving community awards. Each image was genuine, warm, and full of the life Helen had built. On her home computer, Laura arranged them in a sequence that told a perfect story, but between the warm chapters, she left space for 3 interruptions. 1. Graham and Claudia outside the Riverview Inn, lips locked. 2. The pendant receipt, Claudia's signature clear. 3. The short, damning video of them entering the hotel suite. She placed each in a way that no one could miss. Not flash quickly, but left on the screen long enough for the whispers to ripple and sink in. She also took one more precaution. She called Victor. "I want a backup," she said. 2, actually. 1 for me, 1 you keep. If something happens to my copy, I want to know the evidence is still safe." Victor agreed without hesitation. "You're thinking ahead. That's good. And Laura," his tone dipped, "are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" Your mother, your kids, her friends. This isn't something you can take back. Laura stared at the file open on her laptop, the bright faces from Helen's life sharing space with Graham and Claudia's betrayal. I'm not the one who made this choice, she said evenly. They did. The days leading up to the banquet felt strange, like the quiet before a summer storm. Graham was in a buoyant mood, helping Helen with little errands, offering to run her to the hairdresser or pick up wine for the reception. Laura noticed how often he made sure Claudia was looped into the plans, as if her presence was as natural as any other family friend. Claudia, for her part, seemed almost rehearsed. She laughed a fraction too loudly at Helen's jokes, complimented Laura on her dress when they crossed paths at the club during final preparations, even suggested a toast she might give on the night itself. Laura kept her responses pleasant, her eyes steady. Let them feel safe. Let them think the ground under their feet was solid. The night before the banquet, Laura laid everything out. USB drive labeled banquet memories in her clutch. A second identical USB taped inside her jacket. Printed copies of the still images and receipt tucked into a plain folder in her purse. Victor's backup was already in his safe, just in case. She rehearsed her introduction in front of the mirror, careful to keep her voice calm, her smile measured. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. This was going to be a presentation. When she finally crawled into bed, Graham was already asleep, one arm thrown across the pillow where she used to lay her head. She studied him for a moment, the curve of his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. The face of the man she'd trusted. The man who would, in less than 24 hours, learn what it felt like to have the truth pulled into the light. Laura turned off the lamp, lying still in the dark, listening to his breathing. She didn't need to picture the moment. She could already hear it. The collective gasp, the scrape of a chair leg, the sudden stillness of a room realizing it had just witnessed the fracture of a marriage in real time. The Riverstone Country Club glowed that evening as though it had been dipped in amber. From the parking lot, guests could see the chandelier light spilling onto the polished marble entryway, hear the gentle hum of voices and the tinkling of cutlery being set into place. Inside, the ballroom shimmered. Gold-rimmed glasses, white roses and crystal vases, and a low stage set with a podium draped in deep green velvet. Helen Markham stood near the entrance, greeting each guest with the same warm clasp of hands, the same soft laugh. She looked younger than her years tonight, in a navy gown with a beaded neckline, her silver hair shining under the lights. Laura caught her mother's eye from across the room and returned the smile, even as her own heart beat with a steadier, heavier rhythm. Graham was already working the room, moving between tables with a confidence that had once been charming. He leaned in to speak with one of Helen's former colleagues, clapped an old friend of the family on the shoulder, poured wine for two women he'd barely met. Watching him, Laura felt the same surreal detachment she'd experienced the day she picked up Victor's envelope. The sense that this man in front of her was both familiar and entirely a stranger. Then Claudia arrived. She swept through the doorway in a floor-length burgundy dress, her blonde hair pinned in an intricate twist, a diamond brooch catching the light at her collar. Her perfume, floral with a faint hint of spice, announced her before she even reached the first table. She moved gracefully, exchanging pleasantries, and when she reached Helen, she embraced her with both arms. For a fraction of a second, Claudia's eyes shifted past Helen's shoulder, toward Graham. The corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly. To anyone else, it might have looked like a polite smile of acknowledgement. But Laura saw the quick flicker in his gaze, the quiet familiarity that had no business being there. The trio, Helen, Graham, and Claudia, stood together for a moment, chatting as if they were simply catching up. Graham poured Claudia a glass of champagne without being asked. Claudia thanked him with a look that lingered just a beat too long. Laura made her way to her mother, careful to keep her voice light. "Everything's perfect, Mom. Ready to enjoy your night?" Helen beamed. "More than ready. And thank you again for putting the slideshow together. It means the world to me." Graham chimed in. "Laura's outdone herself." "You're going to love it." Laura just smiled. "I hope so." The jazz trio in the corner began to play a soft, upbeat tune as waiters moved between tables with trays of salmon and roasted asparagus. The clinking of silverware mingled with bursts of laughter from one table or another. From a distance, it was exactly what it should have been, a warm, celebratory evening. But to Laura, every moment was stretched thin with anticipation. She caught Claudia watching Graham during the soup course, a subtle glance over the rim of her wine glass, quickly hidden when she noticed Laura's gaze. Graham, in turn, seemed unable to resist drifting toward Claudia's side of the room whenever the opportunity arose. They spoke in low tones at the bar during the salad service, their heads tilted toward one another like conspirators. Laura didn't interrupt. She didn't even look for Victor, though she knew he was there, seated discreetly at a back table as one of the colleagues Helen had invited. His presence was another layer of insurance, another pair of eyes to witness what was about to happen. By the time dessert plates were cleared, the MC stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. The hum of conversation softened into expectant quiet. "Before we move into the final round of toasts," he said, "Helen's daughter Laura has prepared something special. A tribute to her mother's remarkable career and the lives she's touched." "Laura?" She rose from her seat, her heels silent against the carpet as she crossed to the podium. From the corner of her eye, she saw Graham settle back in his chair, Claudia's hands folded neatly in her lap. Helen's smile was warm, trusting. Laura adjusted the microphone, her voice steady. "Thank you. Tonight is about celebrating a lifetime of dedication, compassion, and integrity. My mother has shown all of us what it means to live with purpose. I wanted to honor that and to share a few moments that tell her story." She gestured toward the screen as the lights dimmed. The first slide appeared, Helen as a young nurse in crisp white, standing beside a hospital bed. Applause rippled through the room. Another slide, Helen at a community health fair. Children gathered around her, smiles, nods, a quiet awe from somewhere near the front. And so it began, a perfectly crafted prelude to the storm. For the first 2 minutes, the slideshow was everything Helen. Warm, joyful, steeped in the kind of memories that made people lean closer to the screen and smile. Helen at her wedding, Helen cradling a newborn Laura, Helen in her hospital scrubs, a patient gripping her hand. The applause was soft and genuine, the occasional laugh bursting out when an old hairstyle or dated outfit appeared. Laura kept her voice light as she narrated, offering small anecdotes that made the room feel cozy, safe. Then, without warning, the next slide appeared. It wasn't Helen. It was a grainy, time-stamped image of Graham and Claudia, standing in front of the Riverview Inn. Graham's hand rested on Claudia's hip, their faces tilted toward each other in a kiss. The room reacted instantly. A sharp gasp from the right, the clink of a fork dropped onto a plate, a whisper hissing through the rows of tables like a sudden wind. Helen froze. The smile she'd worn only seconds ago faltered, her eyes narrowing at the image, as if her mind couldn't process it. Graham sat forward sharply, one hand gripping the edge of the table. "Laura!" But the next slide was already on the screen. A jewelry store receipt, blown up so the text was impossible to miss. A diamond pendant, purchased 2 months ago. In the recipient field, the signature, C. Hayes. Whispers swelled louder now, rippling across the ballroom. Claudia's hand twitched in her lap. She tried to keep her chin high, but the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her. Laura kept her tone calm, steady. "In a life as full as my mother's, not every memory is a happy one. Some moments remind us that integrity is not a given. It's a choice." The screen flickered again. Now it was video. The camera was fixed from across the street, the image a little shaky from distance, but clear enough. Graham stood at the door of a hotel suite, holding it open as Claudia stepped inside. He glanced around once, then followed, letting the door close behind them. A murmur ran through the room like a low electrical current. Helen's hands were flat against the table now, her knuckles pale. She didn't look at Graham. She didn't look at Claudia. Her gaze was locked on the screen, as though watching the truth settle like ash. Graham half rose from his seat. "Turn it off. This is..." Laura didn't flinch. "This banquet is about celebrating loyalty, dedication, and trust. And I think it's worth remembering that those values mean nothing when they aren't lived. Laura! Graham's voice was sharp now, his face flushed. You're ruining your mother's night. Laura turned to him, her voice still even. No, Graham. You and Claudia ruined it. I'm just making sure no one here leaves without knowing the truth. A smattering of applause broke out. From a far table, hesitant at first, then joined by a few more hands. Most guests stayed frozen, their faces a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Laura clicked to the final slide. It was Helen again. A candid photo Laura had taken the previous summer, her mother laughing in the garden, sunlight catching in her hair. But across the bottom of the screen, in clean white text, were the words, "You deserved better than this." The lights came back up slowly. The silence in the room was heavy, almost tangible. Helen sat back in her chair, her face calm in a way that was more dangerous than anger. Claudia stared down at the tablecloth, her lips pressed into a thin line. Graham's jaw worked, as if he was searching for a phrase that could pull the last 5 minutes out of existence. None came. Laura stepped away from the podium. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard across the room. "And Mom, congratulations on your retirement." She returned to her seat, the USB drive still warm from the projector. Graham pushed his chair back with a scrape, muttering under his breath as he strode toward the exit. Claudia hesitated for a few seconds longer before following him, her heels clicking in the stunned quiet. The banquet would continue in some form, polite clinking of cutlery, quiet conversations. But the celebration had shifted. The room had seen too much to go back. And that was exactly what Laura wanted. The ballroom never quite recovered. Conversations restarted in low whispers, and some guests left early, avoiding Helen's gaze. Others lingered briefly, offering polite congratulations before slipping out. Helen stayed seated, hands folded loosely, her expression calm but unreadable, like someone already deciding on the next move. Laura waited until the crowd had thinned. Helen finally turned to her and said simply, "Let's go home." Graham wasn't there when they pulled into the driveway. His car was gone, and the house was dark. In the kitchen, Helen poured herself a small brandy. "I should be angry at you for making a scene," she said, "but I'm not." "I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else," Laura replied. Helen nodded. "Then we've both learned the same thing. People are rarely who you think they are." The next morning, Laura's phone rang. "Victor." She stepped onto the porch before answering. "I looked into Claudia," he said. "You need to hear this." Over the past year, Claudia had received 3 bank transfers from Graham, totaling $48,500, all just under the threshold that would draw attention. Worse, she was tied to a quiet state investigation into elder financial exploitation. In another case, an elderly neighbor had revised her will in Claudia's favor before suddenly being moved to a care facility. "You think she was aiming for my mother?" Laura asked. "I think her retirement payout, home, and savings would be tempting," Victor said. "Graham might not have realized it, or maybe he did. Either way, she's not new to this." Laura's grip on the phone tightened. "Does Mom need to hear this now?" "That's up to you, but keep her accounts locked down. And watch your husband. He's already been compromised." Back inside, Laura slid Victor's notes across the table to Helen. Helen read them silently, then smoothed the papers with one palm. "Then we take everything from them before they take anything from us?" Laura met her gaze. "I'm with you." No raised voices, no dramatics. Just 2 women bound by blood and betrayal, already planning the next step. By week's end, Graham had moved into a furnished apartment across town, leaving behind only a few suits and a drawer of socks. Claudia vanished from public view, her only trace an occasional sunset photo online. No location tagged. Laura ignored Graham's calls. Any communication would go through a lawyer. Helen moved her finances into new accounts and quietly updated her will with an attorney Victor recommended. One afternoon, as they sorted files in Helen's study, Laura noticed her mother's face looked lighter, almost relieved. "You all right?" Laura asked. Helen gave a small smile. "Better than all right. I'm done being surprised. From here on out, I do the surprising." Laura returned the smile. The war was only beginning, but now it would play out in the open. And in the open, they never lost.